Here you have a group of few hundred highly privileged Oxford students clamouring for the dismantling of an obscure statue. Meanwhile, in South Africa, Jacob Zuma and the ANC were busy looting the state. And what did these social warriors in Oxford have to say about that? Absolutely nothing. So you have to ask yourself, what is this about? It's not about the truth about history.
What is it about?
This is controversial. In the US, the Black Lives Matter narrative was and is that America is systemically racist because of its involvement in slavery. So in this country, the narrative becomes Britain is systemically racist because of colonialism, which is identified with slavery.
The truth is that slavery was universal, and there were lots of white slaves as well as black slaves throughout history.
European enslavers transported about 12.5 million Africans across the Atlantic to the Americas, whereas Africans have been busy enslaving other Africans, selling to Arabs. The total is reckoned to be about 17 million. And a lot of those slaves were white, not black. Arabs had been buying young African male slaves to serve as eunuchs. It's in the process of being castrated. 90% of them died. Why this focus on European and particularly British Empire? Why not focus on Russian Empire or Chinese Empire? And the obvious answer is...
Hello, and thank you for joining us on The Brink. I'm Andrew Fox.
And I'm Jake Wallace-Simons. Now, our guest this week is the foremost voice of sanity and true morality in the frenzied debate about colonialism and slavery, which seems to lie somewhere near the heart of our cultural collapse.
Lord Biggar, Nigel Biggar, shot to prominence and some notoriety when he published his best-selling book, Colonialism, in 2023, which dared to look at the facts rather than subscribe to progressive ideology.
He's now published a new book entitled Reparations, Slavery and the Tyranny of Imaginary Guilt, which skillfully dismantles the argument that Britain should be giving away billions of pounds for our sins.
If you're enjoying our podcast, please don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment and share it. And if you're listening on audio, please give the podcast 5 stars.
Now we present Lord Biggar on The Brink. Hey, well, Lord Biggar, Nigel Biggar, thank you for joining us on The Brink.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, pleasure, more than a pleasure. And we're going to talk a lot about slavery, reparations, and of course colonialism, which is the subject about which you made your name. But I thought that just to kind of set out your perspective to start with, you're someone who makes your arguments on fact and truth and reality, which in the area of colonialism and slavery and reparations is quite unusual. Most people, it seems to me, are mostly motivated by ideology. And one just test case to look at, I think, is the one of Cecil Rhodes, who's been targeted and smeared. And of course, the Rhodes Must Fall campaign in Oxford to tear down his statue, where you're from, Oxford, has been almost successful. So can you just talk about the truth, the reality of Cecil Rhodes and the controversy surrounding him?
Yeah, so back in 2015 was when there was a campaign in Oxford to pull down his obscure statue on Oxford High Street. And he was being accused of being South Africa's Hitler, accused of being involved in genocide, accused of being a racist and white supremacist. Also accused of running concentration camps in South Africa. And I'd been reading imperial history. In fact, I was halfway through the massive standard biography of Rhodes by Robert Rockberg at the time, and I knew none of those claims were true. So you're quite right. I mean, whatever's motivating the decolonizing movement, it's not a faithful adherence to the facts of history. History is being ransacked for political ammunition. So what's the truth about Rhodes? Rhodes went to South Africa, I think in his late teens, became very successful, first of all, farming cotton and then mining diamonds.
It's 19th century, of course.
Excuse me, yes. So we're talking about the 1870s, I think is when he went out. He became very rich very, very quickly. And then stayed in South Africa and was deeply involved in developing South Africa economically, became eventually an MP and Prime Minister of the Cape in South Africa. So if I wanted to set up to put up a poster boy for the British Empire, it wouldn't be Rhodes, because he was a very mixed character. He was a buccaneer at a time when there were not many regulations. He cut corners, wasn't terribly scrupulous. Um, um, his primary concern was not with relations between whites and blacks. It was between the Dutch Afrikaners and the English. So when he talks about the race problem, that's what he means. That's what most people meant then. Nevertheless, was he South Africa's Hitler? Absolutely not. Did he run concentration camps? He had nothing to do with concentration camps. That was General Kitchener during the Boer War. What was his attitude toward black Africans? On a one-to-one basis, he was friendly, and he toward the end of his life, he opposed attempts to remove the vote from black Africans in Cape Colony. He even funded a black-owned or a black-run newspaper in Cape Colony in the 1890s, I think. And right at the end, toward the end of his life, when there was a revolt of Ndebele and Shona in what became southern Rhodesia, and that was partly his responsibility, the revolt. So he's to blame for that. But famously, he led an unarmed embassy into the hills where the rebels were and sat down with Africans for 3 days in negotiations. And after that, he decided to return a large amount of land to them, and he told a colleague that from now on he was going to make the reconciliation of white and black in South Africa part of his mission. But he died a few years later.
And so, in one of your footnotes in Colonialism, as I recall, you talk about his connection with efforts to suppress slavery in Africa.
Yes, slight, but the British South Africa Company was operating in Nyasaland, and they were involved in attempts to suppress slavery there. And the other thing,
and that was his. He was involved.
The British South Africa Company was his company. And the other thing to say is that his famous Rhodes scholarships, bringing people to Oxford University from mainly the English-speaking countries, in his will he made clear that these were to be offered regardless of race. And within a few years of his death, the first African-American Rhodes Scholar was elected.
In fact, it was the Rhodes Scholars that led the charge against him after his death, and led the attempts to tear his statue down on the basis of, I think, 3 quotations. That's right. 3,
yes.
And just talk a little bit about that before we move on.
Yes, you're quite right. That the protesters were cheerfully biting the hand that fed them. So yes, I mean, there were 3 quotations, one of which was fiction, one of which was lifted completely out of context. For example, there was one where it was alleged he said that you should kill as many, use the N-word then, as you possibly can. And this was reckoned to be evidence of his genocidal intent. But when you put it into context, it's an unsubstantiated claim that he made that statement during a battle between white settlers and the Ndebele. And what had happened was he'd come to the front line. He'd been told that the settlers had just beaten off an African attack. And he was told that they'd actually allowed some of the beaten Africans to go away again. And what Rhodes said was, well, you don't let them go away because they're just going to come back and attack you again. Now, we can argue about the ethics of that kind of warfare, but we are talking about warfare between 2 peoples in which there was no international law, no conventions of war.
And the other 2 quotations are even more egregious, aren't they? One was created by two spliced together, wasn't it, I believe?
That's right. Forgive me, I can't quite remember the details now. Yes, it was lifted from a novel by Olive Schreiner, I think.
Yeah. I mean, this stuff is just, I mean, it speaks so much of the ideological power and the total disregard for fact and truth that's coming from the sorts of people that you're trying to combat.
Yes.
And there's something, isn't there, about slavery and colonialism that is at the heart of all this, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because I think there potentially is a case to say that he's not someone that perhaps in 2025 should be celebrated necessarily, but it's not the case they're making. There is a...
No, it's not.
There is a, you can talk about, his buccaneering, I think we could probably call it exploitative approach to Southern Africa. And we can make fair criticisms of Rhodes, as indeed you did in your summary. But that isn't the case that's being made for the removal of this statue. It's being made on facts that are incorrect and a case that is fabricated.
That's absolutely right. And I did observe, and I say this in my book, here you have a group of a few hundred highly privileged Oxford students clamoring for the dismantling of an obscure statue. I mean, you really have to crick your neck to be offended at this statue up there. If you really want to be offended, you've got to work quite hard at it. This man who died over 100 years ago. Meanwhile, in South Africa, Jacob Zuma and the ANC were busy looting the state, driving the South African state to insolvency. And what did these social warriors in Oxford have to say about that? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. So you have to ask yourself, what is this about? It's not about the truth about history at all.
What is it about?
In the case of, this is speculation, Jake, but one of the guys leading the Rhodes Must Fall protest, whose name I've forgotten, but he was a young man from South Africa, a black South African studying law in Oxford. He went back to, I think he was a supporter of Jacob Malima's radical economic freedom party in South Africa.
And he was a Rhodes Scholar himself.
He was a Rhodes Scholar himself. Yeah. So all I can observe is it suited his career back in South Africa to vaunt himself as an anti-Rhodes protester in Oxford. As for the others, I think a lot of it's virtue signaling in the sense that this is costless, a costless way to identify yourself with the victims, to appear progressive without actually helping the victims.
There's also an inheritance that we get across the Atlantic, I think. Because the statue, the Confederate statue issue in America was a huge deal. Oh. And I went to Richmond, Virginia, before they started removing the statues, and actually, when you look at where some of the statues were and when they were erected, in the 1920s and 30s, in the middle of very black areas, I can understand a case for not wanting a Confederate general, on your doorstep. Yeah. That makes logical sense. There is an argument to that. The trend of them tearing down statues sort of crossed the Atlantic, and it feels like many people have tried to find a way to join in. Confecting reasons that we can tear down our own statues as part of a broader attack on that heritage and that national sort of history. Yes,
you're quite right about the American origin. A lot of this. I mean, I think it's also after the killing of George Floyd, and this is a bit later. In May 2020 in Minneapolis, Black Lives Matter experiences an upsurge in the states across the Atlantic. And whereas in the US, the Black Lives Matter narrative was and is that America is systemically racist because of its involvement in slavery, so in this country, the narrative becomes Britain is systemically racist because of colonialism, which is identified with slavery. Again, it's politically useful to among professional anti-racist groups. It's politically useful to adopt that narrative. Let me be clear, I'm against racism. And in a sense, I could support an anti-racist group. But here's the thing, if you're genuinely anti-racist and you want to address, let's say, unfair disadvantages suffered by ethnic minority groups, then you'll be really concerned to identify the cause of the problem. So when people come along and say, well, it's not really the racism, it's the cause of the problem for the relative disadvantages of Caribbean Britons is not really racism, it's probably as Tony Sewell has been saying, Lord Sewell has been saying, it's probably an anti-educational culture among British Caribbean youth. Well, even if you're skeptical about that, if you really care to solve the problem, you would take the argument and the evidence seriously and look at it. But my observation of the way in which, let's say, journalists and readers in the Guardian newspaper have reacted to that is instant dismissal, which raises the question in my mind, okay, they don't really want to solve the problem, because if they did, they'd want to get the diagnosis right, so their remedies effective. So what do they really care about?
They want the victims to stay victims, don't they?
So they can play their role.
And speaking of that leads us on to your book here, Reparations, Slavery and the Tyranny of Imaginary Guilt, which is a quick and romping read and has huge moral authority in terms of laying out the argument with crystal clarity against reparations. But we were talking earlier about whether you could, before we dive into the dismantlement of the argument for reparations, could you as convincingly as you can make the argument for reparations? So if Lenny Henry was sitting here and you were advising him what to say, or any of the others who want billions of pounds to be given given away, what would they say?
Okay, so the argument goes, British involvement in slavery in the 17th, 18th centuries was extraordinarily extensive and cruel. Extraordinarily extensive and cruel. And the British industrial prosperity depended very heavily on the profits from slave trading and slavery. The ancestors of African slaves in the Caribbean and in Britain continue to suffer intergenerational trauma because of what was done to their ancestors. Therefore, we British owe them reparations. That's the argument. Can I make it stronger? No, I think that's the best I can do.
All right. So
I think if people are listening to that from a certain perspective, that will be an incredibly compelling argument.
Okay.
And I think it ties very much to what we were just discussing about Rhodes, where actually, should we unpack some of those historical allegations and let's see if they hold up water, which, I would assume you think they do not.
Yeah.
But let's look at the profits, for example. How much can we honestly say the empire was entirely sustained by profits from slavery?
Yeah. Oh, just before I respond to that, Andrew, the other thing that would be said is that when the British Parliament voted to abolish slavery in 1833, part of the deal was that they would compensate slave owners to the tune of 20 million pounds.
It's 40% of
40% of the government's revenue at that time. And so the argument goes, so the government compensated slave owners, but not the slaves. So that's another part of the argument. So back to your point, Andrew, in terms of the profits made from slave trading and slavery. So this is controversial. So the first thing I'd say is anyone who says, without qualification, that British industrial prosperity was built on the backs of slaves, or it was centrally propelled by profits from slavery, or the profits of slavery made an enormous contribution to British industrial prosperity. Anyone who says that without qualification is misleading. Because the truth is, this is highly controversial. Some people say what I've just said. Most economic historians who are not Marxists say, no, the contribution of slave trading and slavery to British industrialization was somewhere between small and modest. The leading living historian of transatlantic slavery, David Eltis, in describing the contribution of slave trading to the wider economy of the city of Liverpool, which was one of Britain's leading slave ports, David Elters uses the word trivial to describe it. So the weight of it, the weight of expertise says no, it wasn't enormous, it wasn't central, it was at best modest, and some say small and trivial. Now, just to be entirely fair, I think I would agree with the reparations advocates that yes, some of the wealth that we all sit on now, some of the wealth that our institutions were built with, without a doubt, owed something to the enslavement of Africans. So we're all, in a sense, we're all tainted. I have an answer to that, but I'll just leave that.
What's the answer?
So glad you asked. The answer is, folks, there's almost nothing we inherit that isn't tainted.
And that's not just Britain, that's everybody in the whole world.
Everyone in the whole world.
Yeah.
I mean, if it isn't profits from slavery, it's the profits from exploited white workers in the industrial cities in the 19th century, or medieval serfs. I mean, a lot. It's almost nothing we inherit is without taint. So we have to live with that.
Because this leads on to the second point you made, actually. So you said that they say that Britain was extraordinarily cruel in its involvement in the slave trade, but the truth is not that. The truth is that slavery was universal, and there were lots of white slaves as well as black slaves throughout history.
That's correct. So we have to take on board the fact that slavery was a universal institution. So was slave trading, practiced on every continent by people of every skin color. Now we know that bears some reflecting on as to why that was, but it was. And so, if not everybody in 1700 or 1800 saw as clearly as we do how bad slavery is morally, we have to ask ourselves, well, why was that? And the answer is partly historical conditions were very different from our own.
How do you mean?
One thing is this. In the past, if your people defeated other people in battle, what are you going to do with all the young warriors who survived the battle and you've now captured? What are you going to do with them? I mean, you don't have an elaborate, expensive prison system. If you let them go, they may come back and attack you tomorrow. So if you read Roman and Greek classics, if you read about medieval Anglo-Saxon warfare, or even early modern warfare, usually you slaughtered the prisoners because you had no other option. So one late 19th century Scottish moral philosopher, David Ritchie, makes the dangerous claim, I think it's true, but it's dangerous to say for reasons that become obvious, is that enslavement actually represented a moral advance over slaughter. Now, it may not be much of an advance, but at least the slave got to survive. So one thing we need to take on board in the past is that, first of all, the world was a whole lot more insecure. There was a lot of violence, a lot of warfare, and victorious peoples had a problem on their hands, what to do with the vanquished.
Could we potentially make a case, if we're thinking about the pro-reparations argument, that actually that wasn't the case for the reparations case they're making now? These weren't people defeated in battle. They were people who were rounded up by other tribal groups in Africa, sold to the British and others, shipped across the Atlantic in order to generate economic income. So it doesn't.
No, you're absolutely right, Andrew. So you can't exonerate British involvement there, but the capturing and use of slaves for labor was universal. Now, again, in favor of the pro-reparations case is the fact that chattel slavery on the sugar plantations of the West Indies and maybe the Southern American colonies was unusually brutal, and slaves died in large numbers. Was it uniquely brutal? I think not. So I've just been reading a book by Justin Marozzi on Islamic slavery. And just so your listeners know, it's estimated that European, Portuguese, Spanish, French, and British and Dutch enslavers transported about 12.5 million Africans across the Atlantic to the Americas from about 1450 to 1850, roughly. Whereas Africans have been busy enslaving other Africans, selling to Arabs, to the Romans first of all, then to the Arabs over a longer period, but the total is reckoned to be about 17 million. And a lot of those slaves were white, not black.
From where?
Including England. In the Anglo-Saxon period, Bristol was a major slave port, not long before Africans were being involved. These were Vikings buying up English slaves, taking them to Dublin, shipping them up to Scandinavia, down the Volga, to the Black Sea, and to the Arab world. Also, you have Barbary corsairs from North Africa raiding villages in Cornwall and County Cork in Ireland and carting off villagers to slavery in the Mediterranean. But in terms of cruelty, to be entirely fair, not all forms of slavery are equally cruel. And in the Islamic world, slaves could rise actually to very prominent political positions. And domestic slavery was not as cruel as slavery in the plantations. That said, in 1850, 20 years after the British had abolished slavery throughout their empire, the Fulani people in what's now northern Nigeria in Africa were running vast slave plantations, involving as many slaves as in the whole of the United States at that period, namely 4 million. And for a longer period, Arabs had been buying young African male slave to serve as eunuchs. And according to a French witness in 1863, and this is all in Justin Marozzi's book, it took, according to his estimate, it took 38,000 young African boys to produce 3,800 functioning eunuchs. In other words, in the process of being castrated, 90% of them died. And I'll spare your listeners the gory details of the process of castration. If you want to read it, you can find it in Marozzi's book. But so was it better to suffer castration and die as a young African boy between the ages of 6 and 12 and to die being worked to death on a plantation in the West Indies? I would hesitate to say it was better. So was British slavery in the West Indies uniquely cruel? No, I don't think it was. I mean, for folks, the past was very cruel and brutal, really. So no, I don't accept that the British slavery was unique. Not in its numbers, not in its cruelty, but it was very bad. But let's be clear, this wasn't the British state. This wasn't the whole of the British population. This was some British merchants, and some people who invested in slave trading and slavery. When the movement to abolish slavery took off in this country in the late 1700s, it was extraordinarily popular in an age long before mass communications.
And of course, we played a vital role in suppressing slavery once we decided to ban it. You know, I think there's a very strong argument that actually a lot of reparation was made in the suffering that we spared by trying to stamp out slavery.
Yeah, so we, to our credit, we were among the first peoples in the history of the world to abolish slave trading and slavery. And then after the Battle of Waterloo, Britain was predominant in Europe and became a predominant imperial power globally. And we used our imperial power for the second half of the empire's life, 150 years, to suppress slavery from Brazil to New Zealand. Now, the proponents of slavery will say, but that doesn't make up for the cruelties of slavery. To which the answer is, no, of course it doesn't. No one can. I mean, the slaves are dead. But all you can do in those circumstances is stop the brutality. And then Britain did a century and a half of expensive penance for its involvement in slavery, which is more than most countries have done, and certainly African nations haven't done it.
How do you think the cost of abolition to Britain, to the taxpayer, to the public purse, measured against the advantages, the profits of slavery?
So I depend entirely on the work of David Elsis here. He calculated that the cost of suppressing the transatlantic slave trade alone, so this is not taking into account efforts to stamp out slavery on the African continent or elsewhere in the world, the cost of suppressing transatlantic slave trading alone between, I think, 1807 and 1867, roughly 50, 60 years, was equal or even surpassed the profits made from slavery between, in the last 50 years of slave trading, 1757 to 1807, surpassed.
So we spent more on abolishing slavery than we gained from slavery.
In that period. Yeah.
Including about 2,000 lives of Royal Navy sailors, if I'm not wrong, in operations overseas to suppress that trade.
Yes, and this was entirely the Royal Navy operating off the coast of West Africa. Yes, around 1,700, 2,000 sailors died, often from disease. That's right, and at one point, at its height in about 1840, 13% of the total manpower of the Royal Navy was devoted to interrupting slave trading.
I mean, these are facts which they sound explosive to my ears, hearing them from your mouth, but not because of me personally, but because I know the number of people who out there who will watch it and be appalled that you can possibly be contradicting the accepted ideological worldview, which is not just held by progressive activists anymore. It's been cascaded down through the education system.
Yep.
Everybody growing up in Britain who goes through the school system and university system ends up believing that we're the bad guys in all of this. And what you're saying really is that everyone's human, everyone has a past, and everyone has sinned, but we were the world leaders in doing good, in abolishing that practice at a time when nobody else was doing that.
Yes, I am saying that, and it is said that we British, we know all about the good things we did, the abolition. We know nothing about slavery. Now, I'm 70 years old. I can't remember when I didn't know about slavery. Maybe it's true that Britons didn't know about slavery. My perception now is young Britons know nothing about abolition and know nothing about the century and a half of British imperial suppression of slavery worldwide. So I'm not against young Britons learning about the involvement of some Britons in enslavement, nor about their learning about what profits from slavery contributed to our prosperity. But I want the whole story to be told. And I also want young Britons to know that some of these issues are highly controversial, and that, for example, most economic historians don't think that the contribution of slavery to our prosperity was that great. That's what you'll not hear.
Do you think the British Empire was a good thing or a bad thing?
I have a very nuanced judgment on that, Jake. Point one is both. Like any 400-year-old state, the British Empire presided over some grave injustices and some remarkable, well, it certainly involves some grave injustices, but you won't find a long-standing state of which that isn't true. The empire was run by human beings, not saints. And I, in my book, I provide a long list of the bad stuff, and then a long list of the good stuff, and say, well, can we weigh these up and say which weighs more heavily? And I say, you can't do it that way. How many unjustly killed people is worth so many canals built or so much tropical medicine spread so that lives are saved? I mean, you can't weigh those things up in that way. But what the critics of empire, of British Empire, try to say, well, notwithstanding some good things that were done, the British Empire was essentially racist. It was like the Nazis. So we could say that the Nazis built autobahns, and apparently Hitler had a role in designing the Volkswagen. I drive a Volkswagen; it's a great car. The Italian fascists made the trains run on time. So, they did some good things, but none of that compensates for Auschwitz, does it? Of course it doesn't. So the analogy is, well, the British Empire was essentially racist and genocidal and whatever. And so none of that compensates for, and whatever bridges we built or canals we built in India doesn't compensate for that. And I consider that in my book, and I say, well, there's nothing in the British Empire that was Nazi. Nothing equivalent. And then I say, not only that, we can say that the empire experienced what someone has called a progression in virtue. So we start with the abolition of slavery, the suppression of slavery worldwide. Then we add to that the spread of liberal institutions, of a free press and independent judiciary.
In the colonies, you mean?
In the colonies, so the colonial government was held to account in a way that government in China and Russia and Iran to this day is not held to account. And then we could add the fact that Britain brought up some of the most prosperous and liberal and least racist countries on earth now. Australia and Canada, and I say least racist according to the World Values Survey 2023. And finally, what I say is, the mature character of the empire was exhibited when the British Empire committed itself in 1939 to fight the massively murderous genocidal regime in Nazi Berlin. And between May 1940 and June 1941, the British Empire offered that genocidal regime the only military resistance, with the sole exception of Greece. And if you let me just end with a flourish on this point, which I like to make because it's very graphic, were you to find yourself in the northeast corner of Sicily, and you are driving south of Mount Etna, and you're driving eastwards from Regal Buta to Agira, you will notice on your left-hand side a cemetery. And if you stop the car and pull over and get out and walk into the cemetery, you're surrounded by young Canadians. And this is a World War II cemetery. And these Canadians were all killed in the weeks after the Allies invaded Sicily. The first time the Allies had invaded Nazi and fascist-dominated Europe in the Second World War. And if you walk among the headstones, you'll come across one dedicated to H.R. Anderson, aged 28, killed on the 18th of July, 1943. And I noticed this headstone because it bears the epitaph, which I've never come across before, and I visited a lot of World War II cemeteries, anti-fascist fighter. Now, Anderson came from Winnipeg, I think, in Canada. And he was a volunteer because at that point there was no conscription in Canada. So Anderson, aged 28, volunteered to fight fascism and lost his life. And who called him? The British Empire called him. So I think was the British Empire good or bad? Well, like any state, it was a mixture of both. But unlike many states, it chalked up some major liberal and humanitarian achievements. And ironically, Jake and Andrew, it is, if you like, the progressive elements of the British Empire I want to celebrate and tell people about. And that is what is being obscured from sight completely, I think, for political reasons.
How much is this connected to the sort of critical lens, the critical theories of modern education systems where there are hierarchies, and such hierarchies of grievance, if you will, cannot be bypassed by good deeds? You are assigned a value based on where you sit on the hierarchy, and that shall not be transgressed.
Yeah. So, I mean, there is a view, I suppose this is critical race theory, according to which people like me, I'm white and male and of a certain age. We can't speak with authority on these things, that only the descendants of the subjects of empire or the victims of empire can speak with authority out of their lived experience, out of their intergenerational trauma. So really, I should shut up and just listen to what the victims tell me. So my response to that is, well, it's always good to let voices that have hitherto been suppressed speak. Always good. And I'm open to hearing what the descendants of the subjects of empire have to say. But it's not always good to agree with what the descendants of the subjects of empire say, because they too are human, they too can be mistaken, and they too have interests. And we're all subject to evidence and reason and facts. And they might have got it wrong. So I disagree. I think once I've listened as a white male, I have a duty to say what I believe to be the truth, and they have a duty to listen. And here's another thing. Soon after I got dragged into the culture war on colonialism in December 2017, one of the things I discovered through emails sent to me was that there are people with non-white skin colors who are the descendants of the subjects of empire, even the descendants of the slaves of empire, who agree with me. So, for example, I got an email from...
If you've been enjoying the conversation so far, don't panic. To catch the rest of the episode, just head over to our Substack at thebrinkpodcast.co.uk. And don't forget to grab a copy of my brand new book, Never Again: How the West Betrayed the Jews and Itself, in all good bookshops now.